There is a city on the Danube that administers the world's nuclear inspections, its drug control programs, its industrial development agency. It has a population of 2 million people. Its empire ended in 1918. It has been running the infrastructure of that empire ever since, for different clients, under different flags, at considerable profit. Vienna is the only city in history that lost an empire and responded by renting itself out as a capital to everyone else's. The Habsburgs administered 50 million people across 11 nations for 6 centuries. When that ended, when the last emperor signed his renunciation in a hunting lodge in November 1918, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved into 7 successor states overnight, Vienna was left with a bureaucratic infrastructure built for a continent and a population of 2 million people who had no idea what to do with it. What happened next is one of the strangest survival stories in urban history. The city did not reinvent itself. It did not demolish its imperial architecture and build something modern. It did not relocate its capital functions or disperse its administrative class. It waited. And the world, which needed neutral ground, institutional memory, and a city that knew how to administer complexity, eventually came to it. But to understand why Vienna was the city that could do this, you have to understand what the Habsburgs actually built here. Not the opera, not the palaces. The system. Every city in this series has a mechanism, a specific function that kept it alive across centuries of pressure. Vienna's mechanism is unique in the series. It is the only city whose survival strategy was not to replace what it had lost, but to lease it. The Habsburgs spent 6 centuries building something that had never existed before in Central Europe. A bureaucratic operating system capable of administering radical ethnic, linguistic, and religious diversity without resolving it. 11 nations, German, Hungarian, Czech, Polish, Croatian, Slovak, Slovenian, Romanian, Italian, Bosnian, Ukrainian, coexisted inside a single administrative framework, not because they agreed, but because the system was sophisticated enough to manage the disagreement. When the empire ended, the system did not end with it. The civil servants were still there. The institutional knowledge was still there. The physical infrastructure, the ministries, the archives, the legal frameworks, the postal routes, the railway connections was still there. The city that had been the brain of a 50 million person organism was now the brain of a 9 million person one. It had enormous overcapacity, and the 20th century, which generated more international organizations, diplomatic conferences, and multilateral institutions than any century before it, needed exactly what Vienna had too much of. This episode is the story of how a city converts imperial collapse into institutional survival. It is also the story of what that conversion costs, what you have to stop being in order to become a monument to what you were, because Vienna's survival mechanism has a price. And that price is the future. Vienna exists because of a gap in the mountains. The Alps end just west of the city. The Carpathians curve away to the northeast. Between them, a narrow corridor through which the Danube flows eastward, and through which everything that moves between Western Europe and the East must pass. The Romans understood this first. They built a legionary fortress called Vindobona on the south bank of the Danube in the 1st century CE. The fortress protected the gap. The settlement that grew around the fortress became the city. But what made Vienna more than a fortress was the Danube itself. The river connects the Black Forest in Germany to the Black Sea, 2,860 kilometers of navigable water threading through the center of a continent. Vienna sits at the river's most strategically critical point, where it is wide enough to be commercially useful, narrow enough to be controlled, and close enough to the Alpine passes to intercept trade moving north-south as well as east-west. Every empire that ever controlled Central Europe built its capital here, or tried to. The Babenbergs, the early Habsburgs, Napoleon, who occupied Vienna twice, and was sufficiently impressed that he considered making it a secondary capital of his empire. Napoleon understood something that the Habsburgs had understood for 6 centuries before him, and that the international organizations of the 20th century would understand after him. You do not need to conquer Europe from Vienna. You simply need to be present at the place where Europe's movement cannot avoid you. The geography has not changed. The Danube still flows. The gap in the mountains still exists. What changed is the name of the power that sits in the gap and charges for access. The Habsburg Empire at its functional peak was not an army. It was a filing system. The genius of Habsburg governance was not military conquest. The Habsburgs were, by the standards of European dynasties, mediocre generals. Their genius was administrative absorption. When they acquired a new territory through marriage, inheritance, or negotiated succession, they did not replace its institutions. They added a layer of Habsburg administration on top of whatever was already there, connected it to the imperial postal system, integrated its tax revenues into the imperial treasury, and left the local language, law, and customs largely intact. This produced a system of extraordinary complexity and remarkable stability. The imperial bureaucracy processed documents in 12 languages. The army gave orders in German but accepted recruits who spoke none of it. The legal code distinguished between Austrian, Hungarian, Bohemian, Croatian, and Galician law without requiring any of them to become the others. A Hungarian nobleman named Count István Széchenyi, writing in the 1820s, described the Habsburg system as the only political structure in Europe capable of containing nationhood without being destroyed by it. He was right. He was also a Hungarian nationalist who spent his life trying to expand Hungarian autonomy within it, which the system permitted, up to a point. That point, the point where the system's tolerance of internal tension reached its structural limit, is the story of 1914. But the system itself, the administrative architecture, the institutional memory encoded in 6 centuries of practice that survived 1914, it survived 1918. It survived the Anschluss and the Second World War. It is still operating in modified form in the buildings the Habsburgs built for it. Because you cannot bomb an institutional culture. You can only wait for it to be forgotten. And Vienna has been very careful not to forget. In 1900, Vienna was the most intellectually productive city on earth. This is not a sentimental claim. It is a measurable one. Sigmund Freud published The Interpretation of Dreams in Vienna in 1899. It sold 351 copies in its first 6 years. The city was not ready for what he was saying, which was precisely the point. Freud was diagnosing a city that could not recognize its own symptoms. Gustav Mahler was completing his 9th Symphony, a work so structurally radical that it required a new relationship between the listener and disintegration. He was simultaneously the director of the Vienna Court Opera, the most prestigious musical position in the world, and he had just been forced to resign it because of anti-Semitic pressure from the press and the court. He finished the symphony in 1910. He died in 1911. Vienna named a street after him 40 years later. Gustav Klimt painted the Kiss in 1907–1908. It is now the most reproduced painting in Austrian history. The Vienna establishment refused to purchase it when it was completed. The Austrian state bought it eventually, at a price that would have been incomprehensible to the committee that initially rejected it. Ludwig Wittgenstein was working through the problems that would produce the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, the text that would reframe the entire project of Western philosophy as a problem of language rather than a problem of reality. He was 20 years old. He was the son of one of the wealthiest industrialists in the empire. He would eventually give away his entire inheritance because the possession of wealth seemed to him philosophically indefensible. Arnold Schoenberg was developing atonality, the systematic destruction of the tonal grammar that Western music had used for 3 centuries. Vienna's audiences rioted at his premieres. His music was played, The audience responded with violence, and the concerts continued. A city that generated this density of radical intellectual output in a single generation was not a city at peace with itself. It was a city under pressure. The pressure had a specific source. And in 1913, that source was sitting at a table in the Café Central, reading the newspapers and eating the cheapest item on the menu, because he could not afford anything else. In 1913, the following people lived within walking distance of the Café Central in Vienna's first district. Adolf Hitler, 24 years old, twice rejected by the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, living in a men's dormitory in Meidling on a small inheritance and an orphan's pension, spending his days reading nationalist pamphlets in public libraries, and his evenings arguing about the Jewish question with anyone who would listen. Leon Trotsky, 33 years old, editor of Pravda from his Vienna apartment, playing chess in the Café Central almost daily, working on the revolutionary theory that would eventually make him the organizer of the October Revolution, and, later, the man Stalin had murdered in Mexico City with an ice axe. Joseph Stalin, 34 years old, in Vienna for 6 weeks at Lenin's request to write the foundational Bolshevik text on the nationalities question, the problem of how a revolutionary party should handle the demands of ethnic minorities. He used the Vienna Public Library. He may have encountered Trotsky at the café. He almost certainly walked past Hitler on the street. Sigmund Freud, 57 years old, 12 minutes away on foot, developing the case studies that would produce Totem and Taboo, his argument that civilization is built on repressed violence. Theodor Herzl had died 9 years earlier, in 1904, in this same city where he had conceived Zionism, the political movement that would eventually produce the State of Israel, partly in response to the anti-Semitism he encountered daily in the press and the streets of imperial Vienna. This is not a coincidence of geography. It is a consequence of pressure. Vienna in 1913 was a city where the contradictions of the modern world had been accumulating for a generation without resolution. The imperial system that had managed ethnic and national tension for 6 centuries was visibly losing its capacity to do so. The nationalist movements were louder, the parliamentary debates were more violent, the anti-Semitic press was more mainstream, the military budgets were larger, and the coffee was still excellent. The city had developed an extraordinary capacity for what Stefan Zweig later called Sicherheitsgefühl, the feeling of security. The feeling was not wrong. It was merely about to become catastrophically irrelevant. The Habsburg Empire did not collapse because it lost the First World War. It collapsed because the First World War revealed that the system that had managed its internal contradictions for 6 centuries had run out of tools. The empire had survived Napoleon. It had survived the revolutions of 1848, when nationalist movements in Hungary, Bohemia, Italy, and Vienna itself simultaneously demanded independence, and the Habsburg army suppressed them all, one by one. It had survived the loss of its Italian territories in 1866, the loss of its German leadership position to Prussia in the same year, and the Compromise of 1867 that split the empire into a dual monarchy to satisfy the Hungarians. Each time, the system adapted, absorbed the pressure, added a layer of administrative complexity to manage the new reality. But the First World War produced something the system had no layer for: the complete delegitimization of imperial governance as a political form. By November 1918, every nationalist movement inside the empire, Czech, Hungarian, South Slav, Polish, Ukrainian, had been promised self-determination by the Allied powers as the price of their cooperation against the Central Powers. The empire could not survive the promise of its own dissolution made by its enemies to its subjects. Karl, I signed the renunciation. He did not abdicate. The text was carefully worded to avoid the word abdication, because no Habsburg had ever abdicated, and Karl's lawyers Habsburg to the end We're not going to let the last emperor set that precedent. He renounced his participation in state functions. He went into exile in Switzerland, then Madeira, where he died in 1922 at the age of 34. He left behind the largest palace complex in the world, the most comprehensive imperial archive in European history, the most sophisticated administrative bureaucracy on the continent, 12 languages of institutional memory, 6 centuries of diplomatic practice, and a city of 2 million people who had been the capital of 50 million. And a filing system that still worked. Stefan Zweig published The World of Yesterday posthumously in 1942. It is the most precise autopsy of a civilization written from inside the body. Zweig was born in Vienna in 1881, into the Jewish bourgeoisie that had made the cultural life of the city possible. The concert subscribers, the gallery patrons, the literary magazine readers, the theater audiences without whom the secession, the State Opera, and the Burg Theater could not have sustained themselves financially. He describes the Vienna of his youth as a city organized around a single principle, the avoidance of politics in favor of culture. The Viennese bourgeoisie, he writes, did not discuss the nationalist tensions in parliament. They discussed last night's performance at the opera. They did not argue about the army's budget. They argued about which conductor was superior. This was not ignorance. It was a deliberate cultural strategy, the management of an unresolvable political situation through the displacement of energy into aesthetic production. It worked brilliantly for 40 years. It produced Mahler, Klimt, Freud, Wittgenstein, Schoenberg, Zweig himself. And it produced, in the men who sat in the same cafes and read the same newspapers and felt the same unaddressed pressures, the material for everything that came after. A woman named Bertha von Suttner, Austrian, aristocratic, the first woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize, in 1905, had spent 30 years warning the Vienna establishment that the military competition between the European powers was going to produce a catastrophe of unprecedented scale. She died in June 1914, 8 days before the assassination in Sarajevo. She did not have to watch what she had predicted happen. Zweig did. He watched the world he had loved dissolve, city by city, across 28 years, and he wrote it down with the precision of a man who understood that the document he was producing was the only version of that world that would survive. He was right. The world of yesterday is not a memoir. It is an archive of a civilization that did not understand it was ending. The Austrian Republic that emerged from the wreckage of the empire in 1918 did not want to be a republic. Its first official name was Deutsche Reich, German Austria. Its first act was to declare its intention to unite with Germany. The Allied powers forbade it. Austria was required to exist as a sovereign state, whether it wanted to or not. What followed was a political experiment conducted in a city that was, by any measure, too large for the country it now governed. Vienna had 2 million people. Austria had 6 million. 1/3 of the country lived in its capital, a capital built for an empire of 50 million, now administering a rump state that no one, including its own citizens, believed was economically viable. The Social Democrats who governed Vienna from 1919 to 1934 responded to this impossible situation with one of the most radical urban governance experiments in European history. Red Vienna built 64,000 public housing units in 15 years. It funded them with a tax on luxury apartments. It built clinics, schools, kindergartens, libraries, and swimming pools into the housing complexes. It created a municipal governance model that became a reference point for progressive urban policy across Europe. A municipal councillor named Julius Tandler, who ran Vienna's welfare system through the 1920s, reduced infant mortality in the city by 60% in 10 years through a combination of public health infrastructure and nutritional support for mothers. He was Jewish. He was forced out of his position in 1934. He died in a Soviet labor camp in 1936. The Red Vienna experiment ended in February 1934 when the conservative federal government used artillery to suppress a workers' uprising in the public housing blocks. The Karl Marx Hof, its name alone a declaration of political intent, was shelled from Heiligenstädter Strasse for 3 days. 4 years later, in March 1938, Vienna welcomed Hitler, not reluctantly, not under coercion, with crowds. The city that had produced Freud and Herzl and Zweig, and that had been the cradle of political Zionism precisely because its anti-Semitism was so visible, greeted the man who would implement the final solution with a spontaneous public enthusiasm that Zweig, watching from exile, described as the most painful thing he had ever witnessed. In April 1945, Soviet forces entered Vienna and found a city that was 87% physically intact. This was not an accident of military planning. It was the consequence of a specific decision by the Soviet command, which needed a functioning administrative center for post-war Austria. The city had been bombed. The state opera was a burned-out shell. The Stephansdom's roof had collapsed in a fire set by retreating SS troops. But the administrative infrastructure, the palace complexes, the ministerial buildings, the archive system, the physical fabric of Habsburg governance had survived. The four Allied powers divided Vienna into occupation zones, the same model used in Berlin, and governed it jointly until 1955, when the Austrian State Treaty ended the occupation and Austria declared permanent neutrality. Neutrality was not an ideological position. It was a business model. A permanently neutral state in the geographic center of Europe, with no military alliances, no territorial ambitions, and 6 centuries of experience administering multilateral complexity, was exactly what the post-war international system needed for its new institutions. The United Nations established offices in Vienna in 1979. The Vienna International Center, a new campus on the Danube designed specifically to house international organizations. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which oversees global nuclear compliance, chose Vienna. UNIDO, the UN Industrial Development Organization, chose Vienna. UNODC, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, chose Vienna. The OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, chose Vienna. The city that had administered the most ethnically complex empire in European history was now administering the most ethnically complex international system in human history. For different clients, under different flags, using the same buildings. A diplomat named Kurt Waldheim, who served as UN Secretary General from 1972 to 1981 and as Austrian president from 1986 to 1992, embodied this transition with uncomfortable precision. He was a Viennese bureaucrat of Habsburg formation, efficient, multilingual, procedurally impeccable, who had also served as a Wehrmacht intelligence officer in the Balkans during the war and concealed the fact for 40 years. When the concealment was exposed in 1986, the international community was divided between those who considered it disqualifying and those who considered it, in the context of Austrian political culture, not particularly surprising. He served his full term. The system, as always, managed the contradiction without resolving it. Vienna is currently ranked the most livable city in the world. The Economist Intelligence Unit has given it this designation 8 times in the last decade. The criteria include stability, healthcare, culture and environment, education, and infrastructure. Vienna scores perfectly on infrastructure because it inherited the infrastructure of an empire built to last forever. It scores perfectly on culture because it inherited the cultural production of a civilization that sublimated its political anxieties into aesthetic output for 2 centuries. It scores perfectly on stability because it has not been required to make a genuinely difficult political decision. Since 1955, when neutrality resolved the question of what Austria was for. The ranking is accurate. It is also, if you understand the mechanism that produced it, a more complex achievement than it appears. The Vienna Philharmonic's New Year's concert is watched by 50 million people in 90 countries every January 1st. It broadcasts from the Musikverein's Golden Hall, built in 1870, acoustically perfect, associated with Brahms, Bruckner, and every significant conductor of the 20th century. The program consists entirely of Strauss waltzes and polkas, the popular music of the mid-19th century Habsburg court, now performed by one of the world's elite orchestras in white tie, framed by flowers from the San Remo market, watched by heads of state and agricultural workers in equal numbers across 5 continents. It is the single most effective piece of imperial soft power in the contemporary world. It is produced by a city with no empire. A woman named Hannah Lessing has directed the National Fund of the Republic of Austria for victims of National Socialism since 1995, the institution responsible for restituting property stolen from Austrian Jews by the Nazi regime and its willing Austrian collaborators. She has overseen the return of more than 50,000 objects, including some of the most significant artworks in Austrian national collections. The Klimt paintings that were returned to the Bloch-Bauer family in 2006, portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer I, stolen in 1938, restituted 68 years later, sold at auction for $135 million. The city that had produced Klimt hosted his patrons and then participated in their destruction, subsequently managed the legal process of their restitution, and watched the painting leave for New York. The mechanism in this case produced a transaction that was simultaneously just, profitable, and entirely consistent with Vienna's specialization in administering the complexity of the past. The painting is gone. The museum shop sells reproductions. Vienna built its survival strategy on a paradox. The city that created the conditions for the worst catastrophes of the 20th century, that incubated Hitler's anti-Semitism, hosted the intellectual frameworks of Bolshevism, produced the cultural repression that Freud decoded, generated the bureaucratic sophistication that made the Holocaust administratively possible, is now the headquarters of the world's nuclear inspection agency, its drug control programs, its industrial development organization, the city that lost the largest multi-ethnic empire in European history, now administers the most multi-ethnic international system in human history. The city that produced Stefan Zweig and then forced him into exile now sells his books in its airport. This is not hypocrisy. It is the mechanism. Vienna survived by doing what no other city in this series has done. It transformed its own past, including the catastrophic parts, into a product. The imperial architecture is the tourism industry. The bureaucratic tradition is the international organizations. The cultural production is the New Year's concert and the Kunsthistorisches Museum and the Vienna Philharmonic. The guilt of 1938 is the restitution process that demonstrates institutional accountability. Every layer of the city's history has been converted into a revenue stream. This is extraordinarily efficient. It is also, if you look at it without the soft light of the Ringstrasse's street lamps, a city that has found a way to stop generating new history and start selling the history it already has. The empire ended in a hunting lodge on November 11, 1918. The operating system it built is still running. The clients have changed, the building has not. The Danube, which was here before the Romans and will be here after whatever comes next, does not distinguish between the water that passed beneath Habsburg bridges and the water that passes beneath the flags of 193 nations. It moves east as it always has, carrying everything the city has put into it and everything the city has taken out. And Vienna, which has always understood that the value is not in the water, but in controlling where the water goes, sits in its gap in the mountains and administers the current, as it has always done, for whoever is paying.